Hello, and welcome to this session on the basic concepts of Ministry Weaver. My name is Paul Nielsen, and I hope you're having a great day. The first concept is that everything is an object. Whether it's a person, place, thing, anything in your organization that's a noun is referred to as an object. So when I say object, you can think of a donor or a missionary or a location or an event or a project. They are all referred to simply as an object. I've noticed that missions and ministries have a tendency to organize by regions or areas, both for their donor side and their field side. So the first rule about objects is that every object must belong to one and only one region. While it's natural to organize the regions by geopolitical locations, such as countries, provinces, states, you don't have to do it that way. Regions are completely configurable the way the ministry needs to have them set up. So if for example, you could have your donor side set up by East Coast, Central, West Coast. As another example, assume you're a rescue mission. You may have your region set up as downtown, 3 neighborhoods, the city at large, maybe the county, the state, and then everywhere else. It's important to understand that regions are organized in a way. Regions become key when setting up security, setting up dashboard graphs. So there's more to regions than just pick the county, pick the state. The second important truth about an object is that every object has to have a type. The type is what kind of object it is. So in this example, we have donor. Under donor, we have a type called person, group. Under group, we have churches, small groups, companies, foundations. Types work in a hierarchy or an outline, and whatever is true for a type is true for every type underneath it. One way to picture this is a zoo. Whatever is true for all the animals is true for every animal, regardless of what kind it is. Whatever is true for a mammal is true for all the mammals, whether it's a bear or a cat or a rodent. So in this example, if there's a person who is a major donor, then everything that is true for donors and for person and for major donors is true for that one person. So that's the second important rule about objects. Every object must have at least one type, and types have inheritance. Objects also move through a workflow, different statuses or stages or states that they go through. And this is true for just about every object in the real world you can think of. An order goes through certain stages of being placed, being filled, being completed. A meal goes through certain stages. Your day goes through certain stages. So here's an example of stages or statuses that a supporter could go through. They could be a prospect, a prayer partner, a faithful partner, unknown, lapsed. There's all sorts of stages you could design. These are completely set up according to what fits your ministry, using terms and the flow and everything. Another example of workflow, and this one is a university student, and you'll recognize this, that first you apply to a school, you get accepted. You may not register in every school that you get accepted. You become a full or part-time student, and eventually you graduate or you don't graduate. And you can organize then the students by what workflow stage or status or state they're in. Here's one for sponsored children. The child is first in intake. You're gathering information about the child. They're fully registered. Then they become in the system to the point that they are available for sponsorship. Then they become sponsored. If all goes well, they eventually graduate from the system. If they lose their sponsorship, they may be moved to available but priority. And of course, the child might become unknown or deceased sometime in that state. So it's important to understand that you can have workflow statuses and workflow states that you can design specifically for your ministry. Back to the types and the inheritance. When you design a workflow, that workflow fits for one particular type and all the subtypes. So the workflow statuses that you design fit into this whole type hierarchy as well. So here's the basic data that's there available for every object. First, there's the object code, which is some type of named, numbered sequence that I've noticed every mission ministry has. This is location PE07. This is missionary 123. This is donor US 4028. Object codes seem to permeate the whole nonprofit world. Every object must belong to at least one type, and for every type they have a workflow state. Objects have names. How many names they have depend upon whether that object is a person or an organization. An object can have an alias, which is important for security down the road, and every object has a single region. In addition to the basic data, there's also contact data. Contact data is basically addresses, emails, phone numbers, how you contact that person. And then there's a set of data that can be defined for every type. So a staff person might have some data that belongs only to staff people. A company or a foundation might have data only for that person. In this example, we have Joe. Joe is a major donor and a volunteer. His workflow status is active in both of those. And because he's a major donor, he has major donor data. Because he's a volunteer, he has volunteer data. Both major donors and volunteers are persons, so he has person data. And all persons are donors, so he has donor data. So the full set of static or regular data about Joe would be all of the basic data, the contact data, whatever's been defined for donors, persons, major donor, and volunteers. So this is the basic data, the contact data, and all of what we would call the type attributes. Optionally, types may have additional forms that are attached to those types. A form could be any kind of optional data such as a profile, prayer request, applications, audit reports. The list is practically unlimited as far as data that could be attached. All of these forms are defined for a specific type. All of these forms are inherited, so if we define a type for a person, that form is then true for a major donor, staff, and volunteer. Another way to think about attribute data versus forms data is the attribute data tends to be static or permanent. Your name, your place of birth, date of birth, these things don't tend to change. The form data, however, tends to be temporal or a certain point in time, such as what is your height, weight, current location, a profile taken at a certain point of time, training reviewed at a certain point of time, and then there's usually one or multiple sets of form data that can be attached to an object. So that's attributes and forms. Another key component are the connections we can make between objects. Connections are first of all defined between types. So we can say a person can go on a mission trip to a location, or a volunteer can assist with a need, or a volunteer can present to a group. Now these connections and the rules for them are pretty important. At the end points of each one of these connections, we define which type or types the connection can apply to and which workflow states they apply to. And connections are inherited, meaning that whatever we define for donor becomes true for all of the types underneath it. So while this slide shows the connections that have been defined, this next slide shows the connections that exist for an object. So here's Joe in the middle. He referred a friend of his. He is praying for and supporting this other missionary. So here we have 3 connections and 3 individual objects. Because connections are generic, a connection can flow to a connection, flow to a connection, flow to a connection, and so on and so on. So here is Joe, who is being connected directly to 3 people, youth camp, annual banquet, and Raspberry Mountain Chapel. So he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 direct connections. From his first level of connections, we can see that there are some more connections on another level. There's another person dressed in orange, the Mustard Seed Fund, someone dressed in purple, and the Friends of Zambia Fund. And there we can go to another level and another level. The cool thing about this is we could show Joe both his direct and his indirect influence and connections within the organization. Some typical types of connections could be donor praying for a need, pledging support, giving to, attending an event, presenting to a group, assigning to a location. The types of connections and the rules for connections are completely configurable and an organization can come up with as many connections as make sense for that organization. So far, the connections you've seen have all been just A to B, one object to another object connection, but we can create in the database very complex connections that involve multiple objects, multiple types of objects. So here's a concert and a child sponsorship connection and an orphanage connection. Another key concept inside of Ministry Weaver is the concept of engagement. Engagement is very different than just charting how much a donor has given month to month. Engagement is a way of quantifying how connected with or involved or passionate or how engaged an object is with the mission, how engaged the object is with the organization. So here we see the workflow state at the top. To the right of that, forms. Below that, connections, whether they like a like on Facebook, alerts, whether they subscribe to lists. All of these things and more are all assigned engagement points according to the values and what is important to the organization, and it's all added up in engagement and tracked month by month for the object. Engagement can be combined with connections, so we can say not only is this person's engagement according to a certain flow, we can say, what about their circle of influence, 1 or 2 levels away? I think 3 and 4 is probably not as useful. But this way we can answer questions as far as, when this person became involved, how did his circle of influence grow? How did he have an impact in his circle of influence for the organization? Engagement can be tracked not only on an individual basis, but on a cumulative basis, and you can filter this by the types or by the regions, or you can see the engagement for the entire ministry. And this is seen in the dashboard screens. Another key concept has to do with the data policy rules that measure data quality, exceptions, and alerts. The purpose of this is avoiding creating dozens or hundreds of custom queries, custom searches, custom reports, looking for good or bad or questionable data and figuring out what to do with that. So instead, a data policy is created which proactively watches all of the data changes, and whenever a data change happens that triggers that data policy, an alert is provided which could also do a certain task or add something to somebody's to-do list. These data policies could be very positive, such as a supporter writing 3 letters, a donor praying for 5 years, a donor passing the $1,000 lifetime giving. They could be negative, a volunteer who never refers anybody. It could be questionable data, duplicate objects, someone who is marked in the database as an orphan, but yet in one of the forms there's an occupation for the father. That obviously be something needs to be checked out. Could be incorrect data, a banquet scheduled for June 3rd, 2000. It could be incorrect data, a banquet scheduled for June 3rd, the year 201. Either you have a cool time machine, or there's some bad data, or just missing data. So all of these things can be designed as data policies. This is a mock-up of what it looks like to create a data policy. Data policies have names, descriptions, they apply to certain types, they have severities, there's types, of data policies, and then there's a SQL rule there that goes ahead and defines that. Because data policies track positive events and negative events within the organization, they become a very natural key performance indicator or KPI for the organization. And again, these can be filtered down by the type or by the region, as well as the policy type and the severity. Another big area is list management, and this is usually a make it or break it for donor management. Ministry Weaver has 3 kinds of lists: an opt-in list, which is manually somebody adding or being removed from the list; criteria lists, which are based upon a donor meeting multiple criteria. We want to find people who live within 100 miles of Chicago and have given at least $25 and have referred somebody because we're going to have a meeting in Chicago. We want to make a special invitation to those meetings. And a segmentation list, which is like a super criteria list that makes sure that every donor is in one and only one rung or step or segment, which is very good for targeted mailings. So this is list management. Very, very key. For automation, there are a number of different triggers from a new object within a type, any change, forms being pass or fail, attached data, a gift, a data policy can trigger it. All sorts of things can trigger what is called a named process, which then can generate either actions for a team, changing workflow statuses, ending a connection, sending emails or sending letters. And this process automation is very, very key for reducing workload. Here's an example of that. A volunteer application is put in. When the volunteer application is changed for its workflow status for the volunteer application, it could either be a pass or fail, which then kicks off a different event and moves things forward. These are the basic concepts. I haven't hit every option, every detail. That would take much, much longer, but this gives you an introduction to what is Ministry Weaver. To summarize Ministry Weaver, we have to summarize Ministry Weaver, it is object-oriented, and there's a wealth of data surrounding that object, from its types, workflow statuses, basic data, contact data, type data, multiple forms, what events they've been to. In the future, we'll attach media to the object, their connections, their regions, data policy alerts. We track engagement, conversations, financial data, lists and interests. There's a ton of information about an object, much more than just a straight relational database. And comparing it to a relational database, and I've done this many, many times, to extend a relational database, you basically analyze the requirements, create new tables, create the CRUD, create, retrieve, update, delete routines in the database. And then on top of that, you build the forms and reports and the business logic. That can take a long time. With Ministry Weaver, we use configuration scripts that only change the data inside of the object database. This automatically generates updatable views, automatically changes what the user interface looks like. So the key thing here is when we're making changes with Ministry Weaver, it's the same analysis, the same testing, but the development is a configuration script instead of building the tables, the CRUD, the forms, and reports. The key thing here is nothing, absolutely nothing is hard-coded into Ministry Weaver. Everything is a configuration switch that we simply change with a configuration script. So to recap, every feature is configurable: types, workflow statuses, forms, attributes, connections, data policies, lists, event automation, security. There's no programming for any of this. We only change the configuration. And everything is inheritable as well, so that whenever you define something for a type, all the subtypes inherit that, which makes it much easier when you go ahead and add one more type. You don't have to start from scratch. It inherits everything that's already been done. So this concludes the basic introduction to the concepts of Ministry Weaver. There's a lot we haven't talked about yet. There's advanced aspects to forms and workflow states. There's a lot we can configure in the design. We haven't even touched on security, which we could spend an hour talking about alone. And we haven't talked about how lists are defined for criteria. We haven't talked about advanced browsers. We haven't even looked at the user interface. We haven't talked about finances either, as far as how to keep track of funds and donations. So there's a lot more to come, but I thank you for listening to this basic introduction to Ministry Weaver.